She looked at me across the table, her voice steady but her eyes trembling. "I'm 45 and divorced," she said, then, after a long pause, softer, "Don't let me be lonely." In that moment, I knew my life was about to change. I remember the first time I noticed her. It wasn't in a loud room or a crowded place. It was a quiet café, the kind you only stumble into when you're not in a rush. The light was soft that day, filtering through wide windows, casting golden lines across the tables and floors. She sat near the glass, a little apart from the other customers, like someone who didn't mind being alone but wasn't exactly choosing it either. Her posture was straight, elegant in a way that comes only with time. There was no effort to draw attention, yet the moment my eyes landed on her, I couldn't look away. Her hair caught the sunlight, strands glowing faintly like threads of copper. She held a cup in both hands, almost cradling it, as though the warmth of the coffee was something she didn't want to let go of. And then there was her smile, gentle, practiced, the kind people wear when they've been asked one too many times if they're doing all right. It was a smile that carried strength, but behind it, there was something else. A weariness, a quietness that made me wonder how many times she'd smile that same way to keep the world from asking further questions. I ordered my coffee and sat a few tables away, but I found myself stealing glances. Not because of her looks, though she was undeniably beautiful in a graceful, timeless way. It was more the air about her. She had the kind of presence that pulled you in, not with volume or noise, but with silence, the kind of silence that feels full, not empty. Every so often, her eyes drifted to the window, following people hurrying by in the rain. There was a softness in the way she watched them, as if she were half in the present, half somewhere far away. And I realized then, I was curious about the story behind those eyes. When she finally glanced my way, just for a second, I felt something unexpected. Not intimidation, not distance, but recognition. It was as if she knew I was studying her, and instead of shutting me out, she allowed me that glimpse. Her gaze wasn't long, just enough to send a quiet jolt through me. The kind of glance that lingers even after it's gone. I noticed the little details then. The way her fingers tapped lightly against the ceramic, like she was lost in thought. The way she smoothed the sleeve of her sweater absent-mindedly, as if grounding herself. The faint trace of perfume, warm and subtle, that drifted even from where I sat. I didn't know her name. I didn't know her story. But in that moment, sitting in that cafe with the sound of rain against the windows and the hum of conversation around us, I felt something shift. Something quiet but undeniable. She wasn't just a woman sitting alone. She was a woman carrying something, a history, a weight, a silence that begged to be noticed. And before I even spoke a word to her, I knew. I wanted to understand the story behind that smile. The conversation started like any other. Light, easy, with that tentative curiosity that comes when two people are only just learning each other. She had this way of speaking that drew me in, not rushed, not forced, but deliberate. Every word felt as though it had been considered before being released. We laughed about the small things, the unpredictable weather, the quirks of the cafe, even the way her coffee was always going cold before she finished it. Her laugh wasn't loud, but it was warm, the kind that spread into the room like a soft echo. But then, without warning, she set her cup down. I remember the faint sound it made against the saucer, sharper than it should have been. She looked at me, her smile still present, but different now, thinner, heavier. And then she said it. "I'm 45 and divorced." The words hung there between us, like steam from the coffee that had long since cooled. She didn't lower her voice, but it wasn't bold either. It was steady, measured, as if she'd had to say those words enough times that she'd finally learned how to do it without breaking. I watched her eyes as she spoke. They didn't waver, but there was a softness in them, like she was waiting for me to flinch, to pull back, to confirm whatever doubt she already carried. And maybe she expected me to nod politely, to let the conversation drift back to safer ground. But I couldn't, because what I saw in her expression wasn't just a fact about her life. It wasn't just an age, or a title, or a history. It was a confession layered with vulnerability. A quiet test, maybe, as though she were saying, "This is me. Can you still look at me the same way?" She reached for her cup again, stirring it, though there was nothing left to dissolve. Her hand lingered on the handle, her thumb brushing the edge, as if the motion gave her something to hold on to. In that pause, I felt an ache in my chest. Not pity, not discomfort, just a recognition of how much courage it must take to put yourself bare in front of someone new. So I leaned in, not dramatically, just enough to make sure she knew I wasn't going anywhere. "Thank you for telling me," I said softly. And it wasn't about the words themselves. It was the way I wanted her to hear in my tone that I wasn't judging, I wasn't retreating. Her lips curved into a small smile then. Not the practiced one she'd worn earlier, but something looser, more real. For a moment, the tension in her shoulders eased. She looked down at her coffee, then back at me, almost as if she didn't believe it. And in that silence, I realized something important. This wasn't about me knowing her age or her past. It was about her letting me see the part of her she usually kept hidden. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt grateful. Because in that quiet exchange, trust, fragile and unspoken, had just begun to form. The rain had eased by the time we stepped outside, leaving the streets slick and glistening under the amber glow of the street lamps. The world felt hushed, as if the city itself had exhaled after holding its breath all afternoon. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wet pavement and the sweetness of earth revived by rain. We fell in a step together without planning it. At first, there was a cautious distance between us, her on the edge of the sidewalk, me just slightly near the street. Our conversation picked up where we'd left off in the café, light again, carefully balancing on the surface of things. She teased me about being young enough to still believe late nights were a good idea, and I teased her back about being wise enough to know they weren't. She laughed, shaking her head, and for a second, I thought I caught a glimpse of who she was when she wasn't weighed down by history or expectation. Our hands brushed once, just the back of mine grazing against hers. I thought nothing of it, at least at first, but then it happened again. A little longer this time, enough that I felt the warmth of her skin linger against mine before we each pulled back slightly, pretending we hadn't noticed. My heart, though, betrayed me. It beat harder than it should have, the kind of pulse that rushes to your fingertips, making them ache for another accidental touch. The street was mostly empty, just the sound of our footsteps and the occasional car hissing by on wet asphalt. Every now and then she glanced at me, quick little looks when she thought I wasn't paying attention. But I felt them. I felt the way her eyes studied me, curious, hesitant, as though she was still trying to figure out what I wanted from her, or maybe what she wanted from me. There was a moment when we passed beneath a streetlight, the glow spilling across her face. I noticed how her hair, damp at the ends from the earlier rain, framed her cheeks. There was a softness to her expression then, something unguarded, and I found myself wishing I could freeze that moment, not to capture her beauty, though it was undeniable, but to hold onto the stillness between us, the quiet thread that seemed to be drawing us closer with every step. When we reached the corner where she had to turn, she slowed her pace, almost reluctantly. Her hand brushed mine one last time, and though neither of us reached out fully, the air between our fingers felt charged, like an unfinished sentence waiting to be spoken. I didn't dare to break it. I just walked with her those last few steps, listening to the rhythm of our footsteps in sync, feeling the tension build in the silence. And as she paused by her street, looking at me with that same careful, searching gaze, I knew something had shifted. We were no longer strangers passing the time. Something invisible had narrowed the distance between us. And though no words had been spoken, I could feel it. She felt it too. Her street was quieter than mine, lined with small trees and porches that looked lived in, as if each house carried its own history, its own stories whispered behind curtains. We walked slower now, neither of us eager to end the night. The conversation had thinned into comfortable silences, the kind where words weren't needed because presence itself said enough. When we reached her steps, she paused, turning toward the door but not unlocking it right away. She held the key in her hand, turning it once, twice, as if the simple act of opening the door felt heavier than it should. I stood beside her, hands tucked in my jacket pockets, unsure if I should say good night or wait for her to say it first. Then she exhaled, a slow, trembling breath that seemed to carry more than just the weight of the evening. She leaned her back against the door, eyes lowered for a moment before lifting them to mine. In the glow of the porch light, I could see the layers she usually kept hidden, the strength she wore so naturally, but also the fatigue beneath it, the loneliness that clung just out of sight. And then, softly, almost like she was afraid of the words themselves, she said, "Don't let me be lonely." The world seemed to stop around us. The hum of a distant car, the rustle of leaves in the night air, all of it faded. Her voice wasn't desperate. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. And in its honesty, it was almost fragile. I felt something tighten in my chest, because I understood what she was really asking. Not for promises I couldn't keep, not for declarations of love spoken too soon. She was asking me to stay in this moment with her, to not walk away, to not leave her standing in the silence she'd lived in too often. Her hand trembled just slightly as she held the key, and without thinking, I reached out. My fingers brushed against hers, warm against warm, steady against unsteady. I didn't take the key from her. I just held her hand where it was. The contact was simple, but it was enough to say what I couldn't yet put into words. You're not alone. Not tonight. She looked at me then, really looked. Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she didn't try to hide the vulnerability behind them. Her shoulders eased, just a fraction, as though my touch had reminded her she didn't always have to carry everything by herself. I didn't rush the silence. I let it stretch, let it breathe, because it felt sacred somehow. She didn't need reassurance in sentences. She needed presence. Finally, she turned the key, unlocked the door, and with the faintest smile, she whispered, "Come in." And I did. Not because I was chasing something fleeting, but because in that moment, I knew she hadn't just opened her home. She'd opened a part of herself that very few people have been allowed to see. Her living room was warm in the way that only comes from a space that has truly been lived in. A soft lamp glowed in the corner, casting the room in golden light, while shelves lined with books and framed photographs hinted at years of stories I hadn't yet heard. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, subtle and calming, as if the house itself was exhaling after a long day. She set her keys on a small dish by the door and disappeared briefly into the kitchen. I stood there, unsure if I should sit or wait, my hands buried in my pockets as though I needed to ground myself. When she returned, she carried 2 mugs of tea, the steam rising in slow curls. She handed one to me, her fingers brushing mine for just a moment longer than necessary, and I felt a quiet spark run through me, small but impossible to ignore. We sat on the couch, a respectful space between us at first. The cushions dipped gently under our weight, pulling us closer than either of us intended. She tucked one leg beneath her, turning slightly toward me as she asked about my work, my family, my dreams, the kind of questions that sound casual but carry weight when asked with genuine curiosity. I answered honestly, but I was just as curious about her. She spoke of her travels, the places she loved, the books she reread when life felt heavy. Her voice carried an ease that I hadn't noticed earlier, like the walls she held so firmly in place were slowly lowering. As the conversation deepened, so did our nearness. At some point, she leaned back against the cushions, her shoulder brushing mine. It was such a small thing, yet it made my chest tighten in a way that words couldn't explain. I could feel her warmth through the thin layers of fabric, the quiet thrum of her presence so close. When she laughed, genuinely this time, it wasn't guarded or polite. It was soft, unrestrained, and it made me smile before I even realized I was smiling. Her hand lifted briefly to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and as she did, her fingers grazed my arm. Neither of us moved away. The tea cooled in our mugs, forgotten between pauses and stories. The ticking of a small clock on the mantel filled the silences, but even those silences felt full, not empty. They carried the weight of something unspoken, a growing awareness between us that neither dared name. At one point, she leaned just slightly toward me, her shoulder resting more firmly against mine. My arm was draped along the back of the sofa, and though I didn't move it closer, the space between us narrowed until her hair brushed lightly against my cheek. It was the faintest contact, but it sent a quiet warmth through me, grounding and exhilarating all at once. I didn't speak then. Neither did she. We just sat there, side by side, letting the nearness speak for us. And though nothing outwardly remarkable happened, I knew it was one of those moments that would stay with me. The kind of moment where affection blooms not in words, but in the simple act of choosing closeness. A few days later, we met at a small park not far from her home. It was late afternoon, the kind of day where the sun lingered low, spilling soft gold across the trees. Children's laughter carried faintly from the playground, and the smell of fallen leaves mixed with the crisp autumn air. We sat on a bench, the wooden slats cool beneath us. She was quieter than usual, her hands folded in her lap, fingers tightening and loosening as though she was bracing herself. I waited, sensing that something weighed on her, something she hadn't yet given words to. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady. "You're too young," she said, eyes fixed on the ground. "People will talk. They'll wonder what you're doing with me, and maybe one day you'll wonder the same." Her words fell heavy, heavier than the silence that followed. I could see it in the way she held herself, shoulders slightly hunched, chin dipped, the practiced posture of someone preparing for disappointment. I turned toward her, searching her face. "Is that what you're worried about? What people think?" She gave a small, almost bitter laugh, shaking her head. "It's not just people. It's time. You have so much of it ahead of you. And she trailed off, swallowing hard before continuing. "I don't want to be a mistake you look back on. A chapter you regret because I was too old, too complicated, too." I reached out before she could finish, my hand brushing against hers. She stiffened at first, but I let my palm rest gently over her knuckles, steady, patient. Her skin was cool from the autumn air, but beneath it was a quiet tremor. "You're not a mistake," I said softly. "You're not too old or too complicated. You're real. You're honest. And I don't care what anyone else thinks. I'm here because I want to be." She lifted her eyes to mine then, and I saw them glisten in the fading light. There was conflict there, layers of doubt and hope tangled together. She searched my face as though looking for cracks, some sign that I was only saying what she wanted to hear. Her breath hitched, barely audible, and when the first tear slipped free, I caught it with the back of my finger. The simple act startled her. Her lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected that tenderness, hadn't expected me to see her so clearly. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The rustle of leaves filled the silence, along with the faint chirp of birds settling into branches overhead. My hand remained over hers, anchoring her, reminding her I wasn't pulling away. Finally, she whispered, almost to herself, "I don't know how to believe this." I leaned closer, my voice steady. "Then let me show you. Day by day. No ruse. No promises bigger than this moment right now." Her fingers shifted under mine, then turning slowly until they laced with mine. It was a hesitant gesture, but deliberate. A choice. And in that quiet park, with the world moving on around us, I felt something resolve between us. Not all the doubts, not all the fears, but enough to know she hadn't pushed me away. Not yet, and maybe not ever. That evening, I walked her home again. The air was cooler now, the kind that carried a gentle bite, and the sky was painted in fading streaks of pink and violet. Neither of us said much on the way back. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. More like both of us were still carrying the weight of what had been spoken in the park, letting it settle between us. When we reached her front door, she hesitated again, just as she had the first night. But this time, the pause felt different. Not uncertain, not fearful, just deliberate, like she was giving herself permission to invite me in, not out of loneliness, but out of choice. She opened the door and smiled faintly. "Come inside. It's getting cold." Her living room was softly lit, the same warm glow I remembered, but now it felt more familiar. She disappeared briefly to put the kettle on, and I wandered to the bookshelf, letting my fingers trail over the spines of novels worn from years of use. There was something grounding about being among the pieces of her life. The photographs, the little details that told stories without words. She returned with 2 mugs of tea, setting one in front of me before curling up beside me on the couch. Not at the other end, not with space between us. She sat close enough that our shoulders pressed gently together, the contact steady and reassuring. For a while, we simply sipped our tea, the only sounds the faint hum of the kettle cooling and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the mantel. Then, slowly, she shifted, leaning her head against my shoulder. I felt the weight of her cheek rest there, light but certain, and the warmth of her body seeped through the thin fabric of my shirt. My arm moved almost instinctively, wrapping around her, settling her in as though she belonged there. She let out a breath, then a long, quiet exhale that sounded like release, like she'd been holding it for longer than she cared to admit. I could feel the rise and fall of her breathing against me, steadying as the minutes passed. Her hand, resting on her lap, inched just slightly toward mine until her fingers brushed against my knuckles. I turned my hand, letting her slip hers into it, our fingers lacing gently together. No words were needed. The closeness was enough. The softness of her hair brushing against my jaw, the scent of lavender lingering from her shampoo, the subtle weight of her hand in mine. It was all the proof I needed that this was real. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know what doubts might return or what obstacles we would face. But sitting there, holding her, I knew one thing with certainty. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was I. The clock ticked, steady and unbothered, as if time itself was giving us permission to rest. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of her presence settle deep into me. And in that quiet, I realized that sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks or declarations. Sometimes it begins like this, softly, slowly, in a simple act of 2 people choosing to stay close when they could have walked away.